Hello, welcome again to FAIRtax Power Radio. I'm Bob Paxton,
I'm Bob Scarborough.
and we are the FAIRtax Guys. And I
Elections.
am somewhat back among the living. I tell you what, I have to kind of apologize for last week's last minute rerun. But I tell you what, I was so sick last week. I felt like I'd been hit by both of those trains that are back there behind me. But it was, man, you'd have to get better to die. But we're slowly getting back to where we need to be.
I'm
So
happy for you.
I,
Happy
I
that you're
I am
back.
happy that we are back here on Fairtax Power Radio, spreading the gospel that you do not have to put up with the income tax. You do not have to live with the IRS in your life. You can bring home your entire paycheck. You can get a tax refund every month, and you may never have to file a tax return again. And if we can just get enough people to think, "Wow, that's a wonderful idea," we can get this thing through.
And I think a lot of folks figure, well, I don't know, it's probably impossible for that. I mean, just what are the chances, and they go through all the reasons why it would possibly not make it. And
Uh-huh.
also the fact that good things sometimes take time.
Yes, you have hit on the theme of today's Fairtax Power Radio show. We'll be going into that a bit later, but to begin with, it is time to check on the Congress critters and see what they're up to, trying to put stuff into the tax code. And I want to go through this fairly quickly because I do want to get to our primary topic today. But the first item up for bids on the Price is Right, as they used to say, is H.R. 7169. This is a bill to amend the Internal Revenue Code to provide, get this, for the public reporting of certain contributions received by charitable organizations from foreign governments and foreign political parties. I mean, that has just got to be part of the tax code to make sure that foreign governments and foreign political parties aren't giving too much stuff to our charitable organizations. How's that?
Insane. It's just absolutely insane. And we know that the tax code is rift with little carve outs and special interests for those successful lobbyists who have curried favor with politicians in making inane
Yep.
and some things happen like that.
Well, here's one for you. H.R. 7165, the next one on the list, to amend the Internal Revenue Code to provide a tax credit for working family caregivers. I don't think for a minute that I don't believe that working family caregivers are worthy of some kind of assistance, because I tell you what, being a caregiver, especially to a family member, I've never had to do it, but it is a really, really tough job. I've known some that had to do that. But then again, do you want a tax code that says, well, this person's worthy of some help and this person's not, and this first responder is, and this military person's not, and this caregiver is, and not, and the other? No, no, no. Let's just treat everybody equally like the fair tax does.
Right. Exactly. Absolutely.
All right, moving right along. This is H.R. 7160. This is called the SALT Marriage Penalty Elimination Act. And this one actually does have some text in it. So let me dig into here. SALT, of course, you see that's state and local taxes. H.R. 7160 is a bill to amend the Internal Revenue Code to modify the limitation on the amount that certain married individuals can deduct for state and local taxes. That was a big hallmark of the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act. It used to be that, these high tax states, like New York and Illinois and New Jersey, where they just tax you to death with state taxes, all of that used to be deductible in its entirety on your federal income tax returns. And when the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act came along, they put a cap on that. So they are still working with that here in the tax code. And again, the fair tax doesn't care. The fair tax, you pay your taxes when you buy things. End of story. Doesn't care how many state and local taxes you pay. Doesn't care what you're buying. Doesn't care what your marital status is. Everyone under the fair tax is treated the same.
And that's the way it should be, without and transparent. I think that's the other side of it is all of a sudden you get to see what the federal government costs uh, relative to your contribution.
Mm-hmm.
Relative what you would pay, whether it be an income tax or the fair tax, a tax on consumption. So by all means, transparency is key.
All right, one more here. This is from the Senate side, S 3699. This is from Senator Tim Scott in South Carolina. A bill to amend the Internal Revenue Code to include expenses for certain non-athletic supplies in the above-the-line deduction for eligible educators, and to allow such deduction to interscholastic sports administrators and coaches. Again, can't have a tax code without that, can you?
I can't imagine that it hadn't already been put in. I would think that that would have been in there since day one, personally.
Yeah, tongue certainly in cheek there, right? We got,
It is like a big gumball.
there we go. All right. Well, that's going to do our Congress.gov segment here on Fair Tax Power Radio. I love to do that every week because
Yeah,
just showing people what the Congress critters are trying to put into the tax code is very educational. I'm sure people have no clue all of
no,
the really crazy stuff that's in the tax code, and a lot of these things that were crazy provisions when they were introduced are actually in there now.
that's
So if
right.
it's kind of like, who was it? Abraham Lincoln said the best way to get rid of a bad law is to enforce it, strictly. So the
Yeah,
best way to get rid of a bad tax code is to show people what's in it.
that's
And
that's
yes,
right.
show them publication 17 that they have to report the value of their neighbor's lawnmower that they stole if they don't give it back. So,
Yeah.
uh,
Oh my goodness gracious. Can you believe? I mean, just it's unbelievable. It really is. The amount of attention given to the tax code must be pretty important for our elected officials that the tax code remain like it is so they can continue to supply their reelection campaigns and their political action committees with this with the amount of time that we spend on the show every week doing it, it really is quite remarkable that
all righty. Well, let's dig into what you were talking about a little bit earlier here on Fair Tax Power Radio. Time and time again, you will hear this if you're talking to people in person. I have heard this at Fair Tax booths. I have certainly seen this as part of every online discussion I've ever participated in relative to the fair tax. There is always that one person, and usually more than one, that'll say, "Wow, that's a wonderful idea, but it'll never pass. Why are you wasting your time trying to do this?"
well, there has to be a
Oh,
foundational
excuse
there
me.
has to be a foundational start to an effort, a movement to get things done. You can't just wait for the door isn't going to open and magically your whatever it is that you're trying to get done is just going to happen. You have to start at some point. Now, with the
Indeed.
fair tax, it was 1999, and even before that, when thoughtful men and women were considering how to change things for the better for the citizenry of the country relative
Mhm.
to taxation.
Well, I think there is a lesson in perseverance to be learned here by looking at the timeline of another, social thing that the naysayers at the beginning of the thing said, never gonna happen. No way, I ain't gonna do it. And I guess, when Congress critters are involved, it does take a while to move the needle. But if you've got a just cause, and if you have enough people who are doggedly and determined to keep pushing the cause in the face of what looks like impossible odds, you can get the job done. And I'm talking about the women's suffrage movement. And
Yeah.
I was researching that the other night, and I came across something by the American Bar. I guess the American Bar Association, AmericanBar.org is the website that we took all this from. It is a timeline. We kind of go through it here as quickly as time will permit here of how long it took for the impossible. Women are never going to vote. How long did it take for that impossibility to fade into reality? And we'll start way back in 1847. This is before the Civil War. This AmericanBar.org notes that the first women's right convention was held in Seneca Falls, New York in 1847. There were 68 women, 32 men, and they kind of signed a Declaration of Sentiments, which was in a way modeled after the Declaration of Independence. They were outlining their grievances, and it set the agenda for the women's rights movement. A set of 12 resolutions was adopted calling for equal treatment of women and men under the law and voting rights for women. That was 1847. Now, you can probably reasonably conclude that the impetus for this movement started before then, because if that's the first time people got together and really were, presenting on it. But 1847, well, just for our purposes here, we're going to call that the starting timeline in the women's suffrage movement. And it took 2 years for the next thing to happen.
Yeah, and
that's your cue to go on.
thank you. A couple of years later, the first National Women's Rights Convention took place in Worcester, Massachusetts, attracting more than 1,000 participants. Frederick Douglass, Paulina Wright Davis, Abby Kelly Foster, William Lloyd Garrison, Lucy Stone, and Sojourner Truth are in attendance.
Yeah, you got to think 1,000 people there have got to be thinking, wow, we're going to get this through pretty quick. We're a pretty good force to be reckoned with. Little did they know that
out, because you have people that are involved in a movement, the early adopters, the people that say this can be done, and then you have the naysayers that get peppered in throughout the coming and ensuing, in some cases, decades to get to success. And it takes different generations of people to make things happen. And the reason we're pointing this out, folks, is that the FAIRtax gets asked a question, well, I don't know that that'll ever happen. Why would you even want to try to do something like that? It'll never happen. Well, here's the parallel that we're using today with the women's suffrage movement that took many, many decades.
It took a lot longer than we've been at trying to get the FAIRtax. Let's move on here. We don't want to run out of time. 1850 is the next item on the list. You mentioned a young lady named Sojourner Truth, which is a rather interesting name. She was a former slave, and she delivered a speech in 1850. Ain't I a woman? I was not able to find out the text of that speech. I really wasn't, but that was 1850. And then 15 years later, in 1865, the Civil War kind of put a halt to all of this goings on. And when 1865 came around, the Civil War ended. Elizabeth Cady Stanton and Susan B. Anthony, they formed the American Equal Rights Association. This was an organization for both white and black women and men as well, dedicated to the goal of universal suffrage. And they petitioned Congress in 1865 for universal suffrage. 1865. Now that, is 18 years past this first convention. So it taken them a while just to get that far. And they didn't get very far, did they?
No, 2 years later, in 1867, the ratification of the 14th Amendment came about. All persons born or naturalized in the United States and subject to the jurisdiction thereof are citizens of the United States and of the state wherein they reside. And that right may not be denied to any of the male inhabitants of such state being 21 years of age and citizens of the United States of America.
Of course, again, that was in the aftermath of the Civil War. There were people that wanted those that supported the Confederacy not to have U.S. citizenship. And President Lincoln was adamant that that not happen. And it took a while of course, it takes a while to get the amendment, any amendment to the Constitution put through. But they said that will allow citizenship to people that were born in the United States. And of course, then the next natural step, all right, if we're citizens, we can vote. Also in 1867 here, Senator S.C. Pomeroy of Kansas introduced a federal women's suffrage amendment in Congress, and it was voted down.
So this is all to prove that noble endeavors for change in our country take time.
It does.
A year later, the suffragists split into two organizations. Susan B. Anthony and Elizabeth Cady Stanton formed the National Women Suffrage Association. The primary goal of the organization is to achieve voting rights for women by means of an amendment to the Constitution of the United States. Lucy Stone, Henry Blackwell, and others formed the American Woman Suffrage Association, which focused exclusively on gaining voting rights for women through the individual states. That was in
So
1860.
they had an impossible task, but they kept right on plugging at it. And the next year, 1869, the 15th Amendment was ratified. That says the right of citizens of the United States to vote. It has to do with the voting rights. It's got the thing we're after. That the right of citizens of the United States to vote shall not be denied or abridged by the United States or by any state on account of race, color, or previous condition of servitude. Again, the former slaves that were citizens, they were given the right to vote. And again, they were saying, all right, the 14th Amendment says we're citizens, and the 15th Amendment says the right of citizens to vote shall not be denied or abridged. Sounds like it's game over, but not
1870.
quite.
No. A year later, Victoria Woodhull addresses the U.S. House of Representatives, the Judiciary Committee to be specific, arguing that women have the right to vote under the 14th Amendment.
And what happened?
The committee rejected her argument.
Nope. Sorry, you have this constitutional amendment, but it doesn't say what you think it says. And also in 1870, now this is 23 years after that first convention, and 23 years is about where we are with the fair tax now. It was first introduced in Congress in 1999. It was developed in the mid-90s. It's been around for about 23 years. And about at the same point on this timeline in 1870, the anti-suffrage party is founded. And many people, including prominent women such as Ellen Sherman, who was the General William Tecumseh Sherman's wife, she challenged the notion that suffrage was a natural right, opposed its extension to women. And in their view, women's political participation threatened their important roles as wives, mothers, educators, and philanthropists. That kind of reminds me of what Paula Hayes was thinking when Steve was testifying before Congress a while back. Gandhi's timeline. First they ignore you, and then they laugh at you, and then they fight you. So here we go, 23 years deep into this timeline. That's when they start fighting you. The anti-suffrage party is founded. And again, it just takes time to get stuff like this through. And the fair tax people need to understand that, need to understand the history here, be encouraged by the fact that even though it takes a long time to do, it is doable. And with enough dogged determination, we're going to get this done.
Absolutely. Without a doubt. It's not a light switch type situation. There's a lot of groundwork that has already been put in place by the original people who first time discussed many years ago, let's figure out another way to collect the taxes that's fair and transparent and simple. So in
something cool here in 1871.
Susan B. Anthony, who is on the coin, the dollar coin, votes in the presidential election. She registers, votes for Ulysses S. Grant in New York.
And what happened to her?
She is arrested, tried, and convicted 2 years later in 1873. Her defense, that the Equal Protection Clause of the 14th Amendment entitled her to vote, was not successful.
Oh, mercy. A couple of years later, 1873. Here's where it really gets interesting. Minor versus Happersett. That's probably a case that very few people have heard of, but it was a Supreme Court case, and they ruled that the 14th Amendment does not guarantee women the right to vote. The court holding that citizenship alone does not give women voting rights. Women's political rights are under individual states' jurisdiction. So far, we have not had the Supreme Court rule against the fair tax. I'm not sure that you will.
Yeah, I don't know what.
Excuse me. But those are the kind of setbacks that happen in these social, crusade type causes, and you just cannot let even something like that deter you. So if you're you're kind of getting a little tepid in your support of the fair tax, and you're buying into this. It's never going to happen. Look at what happened to these folks, and look at what happened in the end for them. The Supreme Court ruled against them in 1873.
And 2 years later, in 1875, a Declaration of Rights for Women was brought about. Again, Susan B. Anthony and Matilda Jocelyn Gage disrupt the official U.S. Centennial Program at Independence Hall in Philadelphia, presenting a Declaration of Rights for women. It's like standing down in front of, a town hall with a scrolling banner. You have to be engaged. You have to be engaged.
1877. Now, this is 30 years deep into this timeline, well longer than we've been fighting for the fair tax here. In 1877, the introduction of the Women's Suffrage Amendment into Congress. California Senator A.A. Sargent introduces the Women's Suffrage Amendment into Congress. It includes language that would eventually become the 19th Amendment, but that is way farther on down the road. At the time of its introduction, it went nowhere.
But the idea was then planted in the discourse of women's suffrage. In 1890, and this is many years, almost a decade and a few years longer, formation of the National Women's Suffrage Association. And that group and the American Women's Suffrage Association merged to form the National American Woman Suffrage Association, led by Elizabeth Cady Stanton, names that we've heard throughout this time. As the movement's mainstream organization, they wage state-by-state campaigns to obtain voting rights for women, much like FAIRtax is doing with the state organizations now.
Yes, note that there have been several organizations formed in the course of this timeline. So far, the fair tax has the Americans for Fair Taxation at the national level. Here in Florida, we've got the Florida Fair Tax Educational Association that I'm involved with. There are state-level fair tax groups that are pushing for the fair tax as a national tax reform program. There are other state-level fair tax groups that are trying to get states to replace their income taxes with a consumption tax model on the fair tax. So in the states is really where it's going to happen. Continuing on this timeline, 1896. Remember, this started in 1847. Now we're up to 1896. The National Association of Colored Women is formed with the goal of achieving equality for women of color. This association brings together more than 100 Black women's clubs. Leaders include Josephine St. Pierre Ruffin, Mary Church Terrell, Anna Julia Cooper. 1896 for that one. And then, oh, look at that. They ignore you, then they make fun of you, and then they fight you is back. 1911. Ooh.
The National Association opposed to women's suffrage is organized. And a year later, the Bull Moose Party supports women's suffrage. 65 years after the first convention in 1912, this happens.
So fair tax folks can take a lesson here. It took 65 years. We decry the point. Why in the world doesn't the Republican Party get on board with the fair tax? I mean, it accomplishes so much of what the Republican platform says they stand for. But, Republicans and Democrats alike are addicted to lobbyist cash. They're addicted to the status quo. They don't want to see their gravy train derail. But in this women's suffrage timeline, it took 65 years after the first convention for a major political party to begin to support their cause. Which means hopefully it won't take us 65 years to get one of the political parties to sign on with us. But this is the kind of timeline we're looking at. This is the kind of fight we're in. And this is just kind of what we fair tax volunteers can expect to have. It's not going to be easy. It hasn't been easy. It's going to be a long, arduous, heavy lift. And you just got to keep determined to see it through.
That's exactly right. Bull Moose Party, of course, Theodore Roosevelt's platform. They were the first national major political party to support women's suffrage. And then in 1919, the suffragists organized a parade in Washington, D.C. It takes place down Pennsylvania Avenue, known as the Woman Suffrage Procession. It was the first public demonstration in the nation's capital for women's suffrage and called participants to march in a spirit of protest against the present political organization of society from which women are excluded.
Yeah. Also in 1913, the Congressional Union on Women's Suffrage was formed. That's Alice Paul, Lucy Burns formed the Congressional Union for Women's Suffrage. Their focus on lobbying for a federal constitutional amendment to secure the national right to vote for women. And we need a national amendment that gets rid of the 16th Amendment so that we no longer have an income tax. A couple of years later, 1915, we need to wrap this up. We're getting close on time here.
Transcontinental tour takes place where Mabel Vernon and Sarah Bard Field lead an effort to gather over 500,000 signatures on petitions to Congress in favor of women's suffrage.
Okay, and in 1916, Alice Paul and her colleagues renamed the Congressional Union the National Woman's Party. They began introducing some of the methods used by the suffrage movement in Britain. Some of their tactics include demonstrations, parades, and mass meetings. And they were picketing the White House because President Woodrow Wilson and other incumbent Democrats at the time refused to actively support the suffrage amendment. That was 1916.
And also in 1916, the first elected woman to the House of Representatives, 69 years after that first convention, Jeanette Rankin of Montana, the first woman elected to the House of Representatives, Woodrow Wilson, states that the Democrat Party platform will support suffrage.
They changed his mind. So 1917, Alice Paul went on a hunger strike. Picketers were arrested on charges of obstructing traffic during a demonstration. Alice Paul and others are convicted. They're incarcerated at the workhouse in Virginia. While in prison, Alice Paul began a hunger strike. She's forcibly fed a mixture of eggs and milk for nutrition. So as far as I can tell, I don't think anybody has been arrested for the cause of the fair tax yet. And I don't think anyone has been on a hunger strike for the cause of the fair tax yet and had to be force-fed milk and eggs. But again, that is just the kind of determination that it takes to get this kind of stuff through, to make it happen.
And time is something that we all have. And I guess we think that we have to kind of get things done now. And we don't realize timeline for something as substantial and significant as tax on consumption versus income tax. It might take a little while to get there. In 1918, Women's Suffrage Amendment is introduced in Congress, originally written by Susan B. Anthony and introduced in 1878. It is finally passed by the House of Representatives and the Senate, sent to the states for ratification. Wisconsin and Illinois are the first states to ratify the Woman Suffrage Amendment.
And in 1920, Tennessee became the 36th state to ratify that 19th Amendment, and that put it on the books. And so that's how long, 73 years. 73 years after the first convention is when the 19th Amendment was ratified. The fight was won, the cause prevailed, but it took 73 years. So that when you're with the fair tax and you hear people telling you it'll never pass, just tell them, well, it might be a little bit too long. It may take 73 years because this last one did, but we're going to get it done because the cause is right. And we've got enough determined people to make sure that it's going to happen. And you're going to have to move the Congress critters. And I'm glad we finished that up because we are a slap out of time here for this edition of FAIRtax Power Radio. That was fun and somewhat instructive as well.
Very enlightening.
Indeed. All right. Well, I say that's going to wrap up this edition of FAIRtax Power Radio. We'll be back with you next week. Till we meet again, we are the FAIRtax Guys. I'm Bob Paxton.
Bob Scarborough.
Reminding you the fair tax is the only truly fair tax, and once you understand it,
you'll demand it.
So what would you do for her?
Well, we've got several programs that will help her. We just need to find out how much she makes. But the good news is, the less she does, the more we can help.
Yeah.
If I may, with the fair tax, we wouldn't even tax her income. So the more she makes, the more she has.
But still, a consumption tax could eat up a lot of her income.
Which is why at the beginning of every month, we're actually going to give back all that she pays in taxes on basic necessities.
You're going to give her back her taxes?
Every month. On everything taxed on basic necessities. But we're also going to give it back to you and to every American citizen.